thank you, Arbor, for organising a day. I think, as the first speaker said, it is inspiring to be amongst a group of people. Any one of you, I'm sure, could be here speaking. There's a great knowledge in the room, and we're all brought here by our affection for the Australian bush. And as Teen said, today I'm speaking about grasslands and grassy woodlands, which I've been working on for a similar sort of period of time to the other speakers. I guess my approach is I put my head down and do some work for a few years, and then occasionally someone like Teen asks me to speak, which I'm glad to be able to do. I think the last time I did it was in 2009, and as a result of that talk I got a small job from, or the time before last, I got a small job from Macquarie Uni as a result of that talk. And then the last time I spoke in the Hunter Valley in 2011, and Rio Tinto were in the room, and I've had 3 years of work with them ever since. So I'm kind of hopeful someone from the World Bank or someone is here today. So as I say, my interest is in grassy woodlands, and I've done a number of projects over a number of years. And this opportunity, as I said, in 2011, a company called Coal and Allied, open cut coal miners in the Hunter Valley, heard me speak about work that I'd been doing in Sydney. And at the same time, they were sitting there in the audience sweating bullets, thinking how they're going to actually achieve what they've just recently signed up to achieve through regulation, which was to restore on open cut coal mine areas central Hunter woodland plant communities, and it's quite a challenge. I guess the real challenge for them is in that understory species, the trees and shrubs, and the way rehab's been done in the past. There's no opportunity for resilience. It's completely, it's been degraded agricultural land for decades and decades, probably centuries, and then it's open cut, mined and stockpiled, and it's completely no resilience. And in addition, as the other last speaker was saying, it's a similar sort of community in the sense that things don't just really appear, they don't migrate in. If you don't put them there, they generally don't come up. So it's quite a task to restore and reconstruct those plant communities from scratch in that sort of mining context. So Cumberland Plains Seeds, which is the business I own, has been engaged by Coal and Allied, and I guess what I'm doing is telling a story really about what I've been asked to do and the contribution I'm making to that project. And hopefully along the way we can drop out a few insights and observations and a little bit of theory. But basically it's a description of what I've been doing. So up until that point, an employee or two, some projects around Sydney, and I guess in the story that I told in 2011 about the work that I'd done in 2009 and 10, at that stage I had a job for Macquarie Bank doing 20 hectares of all the long roughs on a championship golf course, and it was all from seed. So Cumberland Plain understory seed, in particular grasses, on a 20 hectare site from seed. And I guess all of you who know, the two basic issues, and the contrast has been with the two speakers, the two basic issues with restoration is getting things to grow or hoping things don't grow. Essentially it's about harvesting water, putting seed where you want it, and doing everything you can to encourage your desired plants to grow. But in addition, there's weeds, and so in some plant communities it's really about too much growth, and in others it's a deprived environment that's really tricky to get growth. And this is sort of a middle ground where there's occasions where you can have aggressive weeds, and there is occasions when it's difficult to get things to grow. For me, as a sole trader, taking on a chance to supply seed and do 20 hectares of rehab, I thought was a bit scary, but I guess that's one of the lessons, or one of the things I'd encourage you all to do is, to be brave and to be courageous and just throw caution to the wind. I think, as another speaker had said, it's not the business for people with high anxiety levels. You've really got to, you got to give it a go, but but the good news is it works. In terms of the coal and allied thing, really it is, they have signed up to regulations and requirements. I guess they could have negotiated harder about what they did or didn't do, and that's partly either perhaps they're poor negotiators or I think they really are genuinely interested in lifting the bar. I think it's generally recognised that, you know, the coal industry probably have a question over the social licence to operate. You know, there is community expectation on that industry, and the three big things that they probably get criticism for and have to lift their game is dust, noise and rehab. And really the other two are, you know, it's obvious what you do with dust, but it's pretty hard to manage other than wetting it down and not operating in high wind conditions. The noise kind of really is a factor of what they do, but the rehab is a real opportunity to lift their game, and so some of them are. So I thought I'd sort of start with a few things. One is the story of what I've been doing and building the capacity to be able to achieve that. We're trying to undertake 160 hectares of rehab every year for the foreseeable future, and in terms of trying to supply completely from seed, completely from the local environment, provenance seed if we can, at the sort of sowing rates that's required to get an understory in these plant communities, you're talking tonnes of seed, and so on an annual basis. So it's quite a commitment to do and quite a logistical feat to achieve. So like I said, I've got a couple more employees now, and we've been working hard for quite a while about how we go about achieving that. I guess there's two basic things, other than the regulation, there's two basic things that might drive you to do complete restoration from seed, in my mind at least, and one's the botany. It's there, you know, it's in the remnant, in the reference communities, the understory is there, it's high diversity, it's high abundance, they're woodland environments, so there are definitely trees and shrubs, but there's a large understory. So if you're trying to restore these plant communities, you've really got to do it. And the second reason is function. So even if you didn't want to do it, the difference between restoring trees and restoring woodlands from a functional point of view is quite important. The grasses are supplying carbon to the soil, they're holding the soil together, they're accumulating carbon in the soil. It's a crucial food source and habitat requirement. You know, it's a key functional part of these plant communities. So this is an example of, I guess this is more to do with management, this one, but the grasses are dynamic. I think we've heard this already this morning. Some plant communities are dynamic, so the rehab can be good, then bad, then good again. You know, like it's, you've got to be patient and see things evolve. And they're also needing regeneration and they can easily get senesced and get old and become moribund. So there's a constant need for grazing or slashing or regeneration of the grasses. And one of the benefits from a functional point of view of when you do that is that the tops are somewhat reflective of the bottoms. So a big grass has big roots, and then when you burn it, slash it, graze it, a small plant then retreats. It can't sustain the photosynthetic capacity, can't sustain that amount of roots, and so the roots retreat, and then they recover, the tops recover, and so do the roots, and this constant pulsing is building soil carbon. So I think this is what they're on about when they talk about soil carbon farming. It's really about management of grasslands and locking carbon into the soil through the good management of root material and careful grazing and strategic management of grasses. Trees are vulnerable to burning and disappearing and the carbon going back into the sky, but the grasslands can actually build carbon from, you know, depleted environments with 1 or 2% carbon, and it would be relatively easy to achieve 4, 5, 6% carbon through good management of grasslands. And when you replicate that across the wheat sheep belt of New South Wales, for example, you're potentially talking about a huge improvement to soils and a huge sequestration of carbon. So again, from a functional point of view, with degradation, basically a bad system is one that leaks water and soil and seed and resources quickly off the landscape. and grasses are crucial in retaining those things on the landscape. So from a functional point of view, that constant stability is good. So basically they're holding moisture in the roots and letting go of it slowly. A plant that's using a lot of water quickly will die, it won't persist, but these plants are persistent. They don't need a lot of water, but they hold it in the roots, so they're leaking water out of the system slowly. So from a functional point of view, hydrologically, they're really important. And as I say, botanically, they're a crucial component of these woodlands that we're trying to reconstruct. Even if you weren't concerned about the botany, if you're concerned about getting grassy plant, an understory in place for a functional reason, the thing that really sorts out a good species from a bad species, or a persistent species from a non-persistent one, is tough, dry summer conditions. And in the Hunter Valley, it gets hot. So really, if you want a grassy understory and you're not concerned about natives, you know, you're talking about Rhodes grass and love grass and things that are hardy and tough and can persist in those summer conditions. None of us really want that. And the only other suite of species that you could put in really are natives. So we're all on about restoration of plant communities, but if you're interested in the function and getting an understory in place, you either need some pretty hard species that we're not in favour of, or you're back to the natives. But again, a lot of it's driven by the botanical question and the structure of the plant community as a woodland, and a lot of the diversity and abundance of plants is in the understory. So the difference between what has happened and what we're trying to do now is generally the two things that happened in the past was that either mass trees were sown, so, you know, Eucalyptus maculata or something like that, ironbarks or spotted gums, at a couple of kilos a hectare, spread out, they come out, massive stem density. Everyone thinks it's a good result. The mine manager drives down the road and thinks, well, that's come up really well, but basically they're deserts. Very few species, very thick stem density, very little light getting underneath, and they're deserts underneath. Or the other alternative was exotic pasture grasses, sow Rhodes grass, for example, and they're also deserts in terms of botany, thick, aggressive cover with very little else. The key difference of what they've signed up to and what we're trying to achieve on these projects, and the key thing to note from this slide, is 43 understory species. There's a white-hot go at trying to restore and reconstruct the complexity of the grassy woodlands in that environment. So that's quite a challenge, trying to get that amount of species. There is no supply of the seed. There's not so much known about the agronomy and the ecology and the establishment of them. So it's and I guess the key thing that I like about from this initiative is it really is a partnership. I think they realise that if they go to someone, a civil engineering company with 3,000 employees, they're not going to know where to start, they're not going to know what to do. They've got to go to where the expertise is. But where the expertise is doesn't have 3,000 employees and doesn't have capacity. So it's been a really useful partnership in them building capacity with me, and me in turn being able to step up to the plate to deliver 160 hectares worth of rehab a year. So in terms of an overview, just briefly on the sites, the three to the left are 3 coal mines, the 3 to the right are 3 coal mines, huge scale, massive operations. The one on the left is an example of rural lands that maybe are destined to be a mine at some stage, but aren't at the moment, which my business has been managing to improve and become a source of seed for the rehab on those other areas. The site on the far left that I was talking about, that's several thousand hectares, several thousand acres of which we manage, and we've been managing for a few years now. They're derived grasslands from overgrazing. They're native grasslands that have been degraded and flogged out, basically, and with strategic management, which we'll talk about a little bit in a second, we've been able to source quite a bit of seed material, manage those areas for their own sake, and develop them from a yield point of view as well as a species diversity point of view to be able to do the rehab. There's 2 examples of management for grasses and management for grasslands on the left, and management for herbaceous species there with Chrysocephalum on the right, trying to generate and manage for that diversity for seed supply, noting, as I said, that nothing is going to come up on this rehab on its own. Everything we put there has come from seed. So again, just briefly, that's an overview of the properties. And the sort of things we've been doing, predominantly rest from grazing. They've been grazed for a long time, and then strategic interventions, potentially herbicides in some limited capacities, strategic grazing, some burning, aerating and trying to simulate, diggings of bandicoots or echidnas, sort of some mild soil disturbances, and a range of things to try and tinker with the diversity and trigger the resilience in that plant community, so that one, they come up, and secondly, we have an opportunity to harvest them. But there's a range of things that aren't in that landscape and aren't going to come up from the resilience of those rural areas for seed supply. So we've also been more intensively producing plants that we think might be good understory species for use in the rehab. One, with a view of producing them from seed, and secondly for the rehab, and then also to collect them and put them back into the landscape that we're harvesting from on that broader scale, which I'll talk about a bit more in a second. So the shots that you saw there before were salt bushes, for example, and these are a couple of grasses that aren't in the landscape but will be useful for the rehab. The other opportunity on these rural lands is there are in situ diverse grasslands that we're managing and improving, and they're rich pickings and getting better, but there's also old areas that have been farmed and terraced and contoured in the past and had wheat and barley and things grown on them in decades past. They're pretty degraded, but essentially they've been left for more than a couple of decades, and they're a basic matrix of bluegrass and windmill grass and weeds, and we're managing the weeds and got a view that from the seed orchards we're going to augment these landscape terraced areas and start to develop broader landscape seed orchards from these previously cropped grounds. So growing things like Capillipedium or Themata avinaceae, or grasses that have dropped out of the landscape because of grazing over time, but are useful for the rehab and can be grown in these sorts of areas. So as I said, we've been developing capacity and capability over time. So this is an example where we've got a few tractors, 4 harvesters. Last year had a pretty good season and harvested over 5 tonne of grass seed from about 16, 17 species of grass. At this stage, fair percentages, maybe as much as 20, 25% being things like Bothria cloa and Dicanthium, but there is a raft of diversity that's coming back through the management that we've been implementing, and so the challenge is threefold: to get volumes of seed, to get the diversity within the seed improving over time, and then to process and manage that seed so that it can be actually used for the rehab. Drying 5 tonne of seed is a logistical effort, so we've had to deal with that. And then basically, once you've got seed, the thing with the challenge of with grasses and shrubs, they're generally, you harvest them, they drop out of their pods, they're flowable, hard, broadcastable. You can put them in a cone spreader, mix them up with some filling material and spread them out. You can put them through a drill, calibrate them and sow them the way you want them. But the understory species are a little bit different. So the seed appendages, there's a lot of attributes with the seed that is very good. The awns can drill seed into the ground. Bits of the lemma and pallet and different structures within the floret of the grass are regulating moisture for germination. They've got secondary dormancy, so things that don't come up too easily, which can be a good trait. So there's a range of qualities within the seed that are in raw seed that is good, but it's a challenge then to get it out onto the landscape. It entangles, it bridges in sowing boxes. It's a difficult product to deal with. So basically there's two thoughts there. One is to use raw seed, and you're back to really using a hydroseeder, trying to separate and disentangle seed with the use of water and agitation. That's viable, keeps the integrity of the seed. But one of the really crucial insights, really, and it's not rocket science, it's about soil seed contact. It's about the seed being not just put on the soil, but being in good contact with the embryo, being in good contact with soil where it can actually germinate. Some of it does like to be on the surface, some does like to be buried, but it all needs the moisture conditions with the contact with the soil, so seed placement is crucial. So with hydroseeding, for example, with raw seed, you need to then run a set of harrows across it to get that soil seed contact, which is fine. It does keep the integrity of the seed, but does compromise. The soils can be quite dispersive. They're on batters, steep ground. Running a set of harrows across has its own disadvantages. So once you've prepped the soil, and we'll talk about that in a second about soil preparation, once you've got the patterns and micro contours and the structure, the physical layout of the ground, micro layout of the ground that you're after, running a set of harrows over it does have a disadvantage. Part of the capability that we've been building is around seed processing, so dealing with 5 tonnes of seed that's probably a bad batch. Early on the seed is ripe but the stems are still supple. Later on in the harvest, so after a good harvest season, we could still be harvesting 4 or 5 weeks after we start. So in the first week the seed's a little bit green but it's pretty clean samples. Later on the seed is riper but stem and things are breaking away and coming with it, so you've got quite a dirty sample in that sense. There's a brief overview of one part of the seed processing strategy, which is basically a drum inside that thresher with brushes and different screen sizes that is giving it a gentle break up. And so the stage 1 of getting processed seed is to gently break it open without compromising the embryo and the integrity of the seed, but allowing it to then go through further processes where we can actually disentangle seed, so you've got a product that you can actually sow. 2 problem species, for example, problem in the sense of that entanglement bridging in the seed box sort of issue, osteostipes and themata. They're examples of coming up the conveyor in that form and coming out of the conveyor on the left there in a different form, which again is still a mixture, still got a lot of chaff in it. Again, further capacity building, then taking that seed and separating it by weight, by size. Further processing again to try and get it into a state where you can actually calibrate it, flow it, place it, get it through a drill, get the depth that you're after and get that soil seed contact that you're after. But again, as I say, it is viable to use raw seed and there are some advantages in that. That's a little bit about the seed story, just briefly, but it's only really the beginning. Once you've got 5 tonne of seed, and that little story about the seed is only one story about the seed. Obviously if you're dealing with well over 100 species, not all of it has come off the management of rural lands. It's actually come from other mechanisms too, which we won't talk about today. From a rehab point of view, a few of the brief issues there, whether we use topsoil, better productivity but weedy, or whether we use spoil and then ameliorate. Again, lower productivity, you've got to spend the effort ameliorating it and building the biology, for example, amongst other things, but it is weed free. And then the other one is from a succession point of view, and from a weed management point of view, do you put grasses in, manage your grass sward with herbicides, selective herbicides and so on, and get a manageable grass sward up, and then redisturb and get other things into it later, or do you put it all in at once? There's a range of things. I don't have all the answers, but there's a range of things that we've trialled and looking at various outcomes from various techniques. But the basic premise is that if you're using topsoil and you're using drills, the drill requires a lot of seed prep and the topsoils require a lot of preparation for weed control and management of stockpiles prior to sowing. The best management for weeds is the management you do before you sow things. Once you sow things, it gets a lot more complex. The swings and roundabouts with spoil is that there's question marks about the biology, the rhizobia and mycorrhizal associations with plants, the biology generally, the productivity and whether the things go well for a while but then they run out of steam, just the general holding capacity of ground, as well as the cost. But it is weed free. Again, just photos of equipment. You know, if you go with a drill, the implication is that you can't run over rocks. You know, it needs to be a relatively prepared area. So there's extra cost and ecological cost, I guess, in windrowing rocks so that you can actually get a drill over. But the benefit is the seed placement. The hydroseeder, for example, can get across areas without that preparation, but it's slower. A few happy snaps of results. As I say, it's quite dynamic. Sometimes it can be looking good and then turn into bad and vice versa. You know, it's not a one-way trajectory, but some areas have been very successful from the beginning and have continued to get better. So there's a range of stories there. But essentially, in the work since November 2011, we've done hundreds of hectares of ground with hundreds of species of plants, including many tens of understory species. And I think, as far as I know, that's a pretty unique situation where we've processed a lot of seed from the local landscape to attempt to reconstruct the understory as well as the overstory of local woodlands. Some shots of work that we've done in Sydney as well. Again, all from, you know, completely degraded, start from scratch sort of stuff. As I say, one of the techniques or one of the insights is really about soil and resource, water, seed placement and harvesting of resources to actually get niches for things to grow. And you can see in those shots from the right there where you're getting a pattern of sinks where water and seed and organics can accumulate, and you're actually getting things to grow in that environment. Getting seed back into the landscape in these highly degraded areas is a key part of building resilience, and it could get you and does get you good results. But if they're tied to a contract where someone says you've got to achieve this many plants per metre squared with this diversity from seed, with these weeds, we'll give you 6 months to do it, we'll come and sort of test you out in another 6 months after that, you're either going to get very high prices for people having to manage that risk, because there is real risk, and really the key is developing collaborations and partnerships, that contractors and customers working together, customers having high expectations and contractors stepping up to the plate, but some degree of tolerance around how certain these outcomes really are. There's an issue around provenance too, but Teen's out of a seat, so...